Well, look, James, I think if you look at the two debates of this election, which have been both in their different ways been remarkable debates. I mean, you can look at them as a two respective separate tales of two different old men failing very publicly in very different ways, and showing, I think, the electorate, or at least planting the seed of in the minds of the electorate, that they're no longer up to the job. We saw obviously unravel catastrophically with Biden. I think last night basically went as well as it could have gone for Harris. And I suppose if you were to try and sum it up, I don't know why you would want to do this, but if you were going to sum it up in, say, an emoji, in one single emoji, then I think you would probably sum it up with the old fishing rod emoji with a fish at the end of it. Because what was very clear throughout is that Harris had a strategy, which was to bait Trump and knock him off course, which she did repeatedly on issue after issue. The best example being of all the one you've already referred to, where what should have been extremely strong territory for him about immigration, a question about immigration, Harris answered first, just got a sneaky little reference into the idea that maybe his crowd sizes were diminishing, that maybe people were starting to disappear by the end of them because they were no nonsensical. What does Trump do? Instead of just ignoring that, which a more skilled candidate would have done, or more skilled debater would have done, I should say, instead of just ignoring it and hitting their talking points, he goes off on a rant about some random town in the middle of Ohio where illegal migrants eat cats and dogs. So, as well as having a sort of long rant about how his crowd sizes were the biggest possible. So I don't think it could have gone much better for Harris than it did. Of course, whether it sort of shifts things permanently is another question. Hillary Clinton was widely perceived to have won the debates in 2016. Didn't mean that she won the presidency. But I think in a situation where momentum was stalling for Harris post-convention and she needed to try and regain a little bit of momentum, I think she would have done that last night.
Well, yes. Who is in play here? Because I don't know, given what we already witnessed, that anybody who is at lunchtime yesterday, anybody who was still signed up to Donald Trump's ticket, I don't know that anything is going to detach them from Donald Trump's ticket. The man's a multiple felon, a adjudicated rapist. We've all heard the tapes of him boasting about committing sexual assault. We're familiar with the way that he maligned Gold Star families and mocked disabled journalists. We know that the man is, by any objective measure, utterly contemptible. So a poor debate performance isn't going to be the straw that breaks many camels' backs, is it?
Well, I mean, look, the American electorate, as we know, goes without saying, highly, highly polarized. It is remarkable how resilient, as you refer to, James, Trump's coalition is in some ways, considering everything we know about him. He still always can rely on between 44, 45, 46% of the electorate. That is no mean thing. And you can't underestimate the extent to which some of that is about his political virtues, in the sense that, for example, for whatever reason, he manages to command 66% of the non-college educated white votes. That makes it very hard when you consider that's 40% of the electorate overall. That means it's very hard for any candidate actually to beat him. That said, the thing that she had to try and do was if you think about the kind of stages of her campaign, she takes over from Biden when Democrats are flatlining. Trump is way, way ahead. Just by her entry into the race, she manages to put the Democrats back into contention and get to roughly level pegging with Trump. She manages to reassemble a lot of, but crucially not all, of the Democratic winning coalition that put Biden over the top in 2020. And what's really interesting is if you look at the polls, she has still been, although she's done better with that coalition, she's still been doing not as well as Biden did in 2020 with several key groups: black voters, Latino voters, young voters. According to all of the polls, a large percentage of them wanted to see more of Harris and give more of a sense of herself and introduction to herself. So if she has managed to do, there is a long way of saying, there is perhaps a surprising number of people who you would think would be in one camp or the other who were not attached last night. The other thing she had to do, which I think that she did succeed in doing, whether it stays like this is another question. There's a general feeling that if this is an election about where the economy is, about where immigration is, about some of these policy issues, Trump wins. Because for whatever reason, and we didn't need to detain us about whether it's true or not, there is a sort of feeling, and Trump has been very skillful in kind of creating this impression, that all of these things were much better when he was president, right? But if it's a referendum, and if this is an election, is a referendum on Trump and his capacity, then Harris wins. And last night was, I think, no doubt, wherever you stand on the two candidates, and Harris certainly has her weaknesses, it was a living kind of embodiment of the problems with another Trump presidency and candidacy, and a study of his lack of capacity and perhaps diminishing capacity in a way that is somewhat akin to what happened with Biden by comparison to even where he was 4 or certainly 8 years ago when he first ran in 2016.
That's an acute observation. What are Harris's weaknesses then? Because two questions really in conclusion. What would those weaknesses be? Were they on display last night? And are there going to be any more debates?
So yeah, I mean, I think there's a sort of personal weakness, which is that she can be somewhat vague. She can be a little waffly. You know, she doesn't necessarily have, in terms of the sort of clear responses that you might expect from a candidate. I think some of that is because she's got into it quite quickly. She hasn't had all that time to kind of hone it. We kind of forget that. I think the biggest weakness she has is one that she perhaps can't do that much about, which is that this is such a weird election, right? In the sense that, according to all of the polls, Americans want this to be a change election. Now, normally in any election, the change candidate is obvious because it's the person who's not in office. Yes. But what's weird about this is that you have two versions of incumbency, right? I mean, there's the vice president who is an incumbent, so she's in a difficult position of having to kind of defend the Biden record, but at the same time promise change. Bear in mind that it's difficult for vice presidents to do. It's probably one of the reasons that only 4 sitting vice presidents since the foundation of the Republic have become president from office. And indeed, most of those happened in the early 19th century. The last one, most recent one, was George H.W. Bush in 1988. For a country that's kind of a bit addicted to kind of renewal and change, political renewal, it's kind of quite hard for a sitting vice president to do. So that's number one. But she has an advantage in another sense, which is that Trump is also an incumbent, in a sense that it's very unusual to have a former president running for office, highly unusual. So whoever can kind of wrest the change mantle is in a really good position. The polling so far, though, has suggested that actually most American voters, again, for whatever reason, associate Trump with the idea of being change and Harris with being continuity. And if that happens, and if that's the general impression up to election day, you have to say that Trump was certainly before last night favoured. On the question of whether there'll be another debate, I mean, who knows? I mean, Harris called for one immediately, and Harris campaign immediately.
That's significant. That means they've read. That means they know where the laurels lie, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I would have thought the Trump campaign would be reluctant on the basis of what happened last night.
But his pride perhaps will be pricked.
Indeed.
Ooh,
So
it's all to play for.
If we're on Fox, but then Harris wouldn't do it. So.
No, because Fox, of course, has a long history of deliberately manipulating information and reporting things in favour of Donald Trump, for which they were fined, I think, somewhere in the region of 7, or well, it doesn't quite work like that. They were sued by the voting machine makers after their coverage of Donald Trump's claims regarding the last election. How significant is Taylor Swift's intervention, Lewis Goodall?
Wow, now I knew you'd do this to me. Look. I can't even think of one of her songs.
Come on, mate, shake it up.
Yeah, shake it up. Oh, there we go. I was up to date. Look, I think Swift did shake it up, whatever. Look, she did endorse Biden in 2020. It's true that, I mean, my understanding is she's even bigger since then. It is absolutely true to that. I mean, what was smart about it, what's clearly learned about it, is that she could have just said, I'm endorsing Kamala Harris, and Tim was. But obviously, she invoked J.D. Vance and the now infamous cat lady comment, basically saying it's a cat lady herself. And I think that in the sort of meme era that we live in, you can't underestimate it. And the same way that the biggest success last night actually was that for Harris was that, obviously tens of millions of Americans would have been watching it, but most Americans will obviously see it chopped up and clipped up through the variety of clips that go around TikTok and social media elsewhere, particularly younger voters. And on that score, Harris won absolutely hands down because she had about 6 very strong clips, and Trump's best clip, or most sort of notable clip, was his talking about immigrants consuming household pets.
Cats and dogs. Thank you, Lewis Goodall, as always. I suppose you could say that the bad blood between Taylor Swift and Donald Trump would be beyond Kamala Harris's wildest dreams. Indeed, she may consider the intervention to be gorgeous. You have to remember, however, that Donald Trump remains something of an anti-hero in the minds of many Americans, and so the situation is, of course, delicate. I think that probably we or you need to calm down. And there's a special prize for anybody who spotted all of the Taylor Swift song titles in that little concluding comment.